Can defense expenditures be curtailed or reduced? I think in prevailing circumstances all over the world, there is an opposite trend, that is rise in the defense expenditures. According to International Peace Research Institute (SIPRI) yearbook, the global defense expenditures have reached more than $2 trillion. And that is despite the fact that many countries are below poverty line, that the arms race which is going on is consuming resources. So defense expenditures must be curtailed, but then there are various issues. And for that matter, one has to refer to the decision which has been made by Sri Lanka, that the Minister of State for Defense Sri Lanka announced recently that his country would reduce the strength of military to almost 50% by 2030. That is, 1/3 of the strength of the military will be reduced in 2 years' time, and the rest in 30 years' time. And Sri Lanka basically faced a terrible economic situation. Default. It defaulted, its economy defaulted. Sri Lanka is under serious debt. And the idea to reduce defense expenditures of Sri Lankan armed forces, that is primarily to prevent a massive economic fallout or the implications of default. So that is what they have agreed. They have decided on that, to reduce defense expenditures. Under the name of national security and countering the Tamil insurgency in Sri Lanka for several years, the Sri Lankan military strength reached its peak to more than 300,000 and then was reduced. Currently, it is 200,000. So primarily, how the reduction in the military expenditures or defense expenditures will have a positive impact in order to deal with the economic predicament of various countries. Pakistan is also one of the countries which is facing a serious economic fallout. But there is no debate as such in Pakistan to reduce defense expenditures, which primarily during this fiscal year 22-23 around more than $8 billion. And that is something which is consuming the bulk of the resources of the country. In fact, it is indicated that there are two major heads which consume 80% of the resources, financial resources of Pakistan, the budget of Pakistan. The first is debt servicing and the second is defense. So it needs bold and courageous decision. And to what extent, if Pakistan decides to cut its defense expenditures from, let's say, from $8 billion to $6 billion, it will have a positive impact. Then there are various issues, that if India is spending $80 billion a year on its military, it is number third. First is United States, which is spending $840 billion of on its defense or the military expenditures, $840 billion. Second is China, and third is India, fourth is Russia, and fifth is Britain. So in a situation when India has its ambitions, its power ambitions, its expansionist designs, to argue that Pakistan should reduce its defense expenditures is contested. But then Pakistan is a nuclear state. And if it is a nuclear state and is following a policy of minimum nuclear deterrence, then why there is a need to have such a huge conventional army? That's an argument that Pakistan can save a lot of money by slashing its conventional forces and other security expenditures, which is taking the toll of its economy. Now, if on the one hand Sri Lanka has decided to reduce the size of its military to half in coming 6-7 years, there is another country, Japan, which has decided to augment and to increase its defense expenditures compared to 2% of its GDP. And while meeting the Japanese Prime Minister, the American President Joseph Biden complimented the Japanese decision. That Japan needs to be complimented, needs to be appreciated. That is, it has increased its defense expenditures, almost double its defense expenditures, which is certainly a sign of caution to the neighbors of Japan, given Japan's Tokyo's past militarization, expansionism, jingoism, chauvinism, occupation of the vast areas of Southeast Asia and East Asia. So United States, that's a very classical example, that is expending $840 billion on its military. It has a huge military, number one. But then the debt of the US is $31 trillion. The GDP of US is $23 trillion. So more than the GDP is the debt of the US, $31 trillion. So can a country which is buried under its debt, and a country which is fast, moving in the direction as a developing country, that whenever there is a snowstorm or there is you have a cyclone or things like that, it takes the toll of electricity as a power breakdown. Infrastructure of the US is very poor, as was basically commented by the former American President Donald Trump. How can that country afford to? And it negates the famous saying of the former American President Barack Obama, that a nation should live within its means. The US is not living its means. Is spending around half of global military expenditures, $50 billion. And there is no consideration, there is no rethinking. And it reminds me that during the first term of the US President Bill Clinton, his regime, his government had slashed military expenditures because the Cold War had ended and there was no point in spending billions and billions on defense. So the Clinton administration resorted to heavy cut in defense expenditures and succeeded in almost 30% of it. At that time it was hardly $200 billion, $300 billion. So that is something which we have to take into account, that when a country like the United States is spending so much, $840 billion on its military, and its debt is $31 trillion, its GDP is $23 trillion. So it means that sooner or later the United States will face an economic meltdown. And certainly in the past also the federal government had shut down, the Congress had refused to approve the budget and things like that. To sum up, certainly there is a need to cut military expenditures, to rationalize defense expenditures, because it is at the expense of taxpayers. And Sri Lanka has created an example by announcing to slash its military by half in coming 7 years. But then, of course, there are mafias, there are vested interest groups, the military industrial complex, it is their vested interest. And if India can, it has to basically decide, given its poverty, given the fact that almost half of the poor live in South Asia, can India afford to spend $80 billion as far as the military, the defense is concerned? China is a rich country, it's world's second largest economy. India is not. India is barely fifth largest economy of the world. So I think the time has come to give a serious thought as far as slashing defense expenditures, rationalizing it so as to conserve resources and to spend such resources for human and social development. Thank you very much.